Good morning. Today is Friday, August 13th, 2010, or 2010, however you like to say it. My name is Gail G. Trell, and it is my pleasure to interview today Alan E. Silberman at his home at 769 Rockrimmon Road in Stamford, Connecticut. This interview is part of the Oral History Archives of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. And the videographer is Julian Reitman. So we will begin. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning, Gail.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We are going to begin at the beginning.
Okay.
If you can tell me a little bit about your grandparents and your parents and on.
Okay. Well, I was born in Stamford on April 7th, 1928. I grew up at 42 Brightside Drive in Japan. I believe that my parents bought the house in 1929 and lived there till 1956, so I grew up there. And Stamford was a different town then. There was really nothing north of Bull's Head. I had many friends down there. As a matter of fact, just interesting, just a few weeks ago, I know you interviewed Eddie Backer, and I was talking to his wife at a wedding a few weeks ago, and she said that they wanted to move to Japan, and Eddie's mother said, "Oh, there aren't any Jewish people in Japan," and eventually they moved there, and they're very happy there, but that wasn't true. There were a great number of Jewish people. As a matter of fact, when I think about all of this, and I think about how many families no longer exist here, people next door to us was by the name of Futterman. Futterman was well known because they had a plumbing supply house in both Greenwich and New Rochelle called Footy and Company. They don't exist anymore. And Bill Futterman lived in Stamford. I think he's passed away many years ago. I saw him maybe 40 years ago. Now down the street from me was Dick Martin, who I started kindergarten with. We were roommates at Colby College. I was best man at his wedding. He still lives in Stamford as a member of Temple Bethel with his wife. Across the street from me, this is a name probably nobody knows, was a guy named Charlie Wexler. Charlie Wexler was an attorney. He was corporation counsel of the city of Stamford. This is back, it must have been back during World War II. And the mayor then was a guy named Charlie Moore, who was a friend of Charlie, and he used to come over on Sundays. I remember my father would be working in the Victory Garden, and Charlie Moore would sit on the front steps reading the Bridgeport Herald, which was then quite well known as a sort of a rag sheet in a way, like the New York Post today, I'd say. And I can just visualize him sitting there. And of course, he was Jewish, and his daughter married one of the Rosenblum boys from Rosenblum and Walter. I don't know if anybody even knows that name anymore. They eventually moved out to, he was a chemist, he moved out to Chicago. I think she's gone now. And these are people that today people don't even know about. Down the street was people by the name of Brown. At one time in Stamford, right where opposite the Palace Theater, there used to be a grocery store called Brown Brothers, and they were the finest store in Stamford. And he died many years ago, and they went out of business, I guess, when urban renewal started. Now Stamford, when I grew up, my family was in the furniture business. It was started by my grandfather in 1890, who came from Minsk, Pinsk, Gabornia, I'm told. And the family was very, very proud of this. We were the leading store in Stamford and lasted for 80 years. I closed it in 1977. My grandfather was a very aggressive man. In 1930, he bought a furniture store up in Norwich. And he moved up there with two of his children and left the rest of them in Stamford. And the Norwich store at one time became very well known. It was one of the first stores that had interior designers. and this is in the 30s and 40s when there was no throughways. They used to get customers from New Haven and Hartford. In fact, when I took over the store, it was held up to me that this is what we should have done. When I think of Stamford, and of course our store was on Main Street, and most of the stores in downtown Stamford were Jewish-owned stores. There was, well, as a matter of fact, my father was born on Pacific Street, and he talks about Abe Wapsie. Now, Abe Wapsie became a judge. He was probably the first Jewish judge in Stamford. And Wapsie Rosenqueskin, I always thought was named after him, but it isn't, because he took in his younger brother Mike, and Mike is the first Wapsie. Abe died around 1944. I was friendly with his youngest son and went to his wedding probably back in the when I was still at Colby, late 40s. And his oldest brother, Jack, who was a longtime member of Temple Bethel, died just a few years ago. And I always thought that, today I'm probably the longest standing member of Temple Bethel, because my maternal grandfather, Philip Krumholz, was one of the founders. And interesting enough, I'm told one of the reasons he founded it was that he had two daughters, and he wanted to sit with them. And so I thought that when Jack passed away, that probably left me. I don't know if there's anyone else. There may be people older, but I don't think anyone has been a member that long. Now, downtown Stamford was most of the stores were Jewish stores. In fact, if you went around on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, the whole town was closed down. And that lasted until urban renewal came along. My history is I went to Rogers School for 10 years. In those days, there was no junior high school, and high school was only 3 years. So I went from kindergarten through 9th grade. Then I went to Stamford High for a year, and I went away to a boarding school called the Hotchkiss for 3 years, and then went, in reality, I left Stamford when I was 15. Then I went to college for 4 years, and then I was in the Army for 2 years. When I got out of the Army, I went to work in the training program of Abraham and Strauss in Brooklyn, which in those days was probably the best run department store in the United States. Subsequently, I went to Macy's, which was probably one of the poorer run stores in the United States. And eventually in 1957, I came to the furniture business, which I was brought up in. And as I think about Pacific Street, where my father was born, it had all these Jewish stores. On Sundays, we used to go to Max Meyer's to buy our lox and bagel. My father always used to go to Sandhouse Hardware. I mean, these names are gone now. A Wise paint store was there. I knew Sam Wise. And he had a daughter who was extremely popular, Margie Wise, who died of some sort of a heart thing when she was still in high school. Also on that street there were the kosher butcher shops, the Atlantic Fish Market, which I remember my grandmother used to go to buy fish to make filter fish. And it was sort of a Jewish street in many ways. There were other well-known stores. There was Wallman's Furniture. I don't think there are no Wallman's left in Stamford. And of course Frank Martin's was well known. And there was the National Trunk and Umbrella. I don't know if you... Okay, there was owned by people by the name of Robbins. And Eve Robbins was a lawyer. This is a Jewish woman who was a lawyer in 1925. That's pretty unusual. And after my father died, and I think his name was Ed, she and my mother went to a trip to England. And they went out to Stonehenge. And while they were coming back, she was sitting next to my mother, she died. So, all these stories, and her, I think her daughter lived in Stamford for a long time, and her son was a professor at Mount Holyoke for many years. I have no contact with these people. Dick Martin went into Mantell and Martin, which was his father's store, and of course Mantells were a well-known family. The biggest, it was interesting, when I used to take credit applications, the name most given, there were two names most given. There was no credit cards then, and there were no Bloomingdales, was C.O. Miller's and Frankls. Almost everybody went to Frankl's. And my father was a hunter, and once a year he would go up to the Adirondacks, to New Russia, New York, and he would go with Harold Frankl and Mr. Spelke, Morris Spelke. They were hunters, and they went for years and years. And of course, Spelke's was the best shoe store in Stamford. And we also used to buy our shoes from Rimland's on Pacific Street. Now all these stores are gone, and of course what happened is that when urban renewal came along, they really put everyone out of business. And a rather derogatory thing that I must say, obviously we were involved in urban renewal, and eventually they took our building. And I was one of the fighters against it. And there was a woman who headed it by the name of Gertrude Marshall, who was sort of a shill for the rich company. And I nicknamed her Mrs. Ikeman because that's the way I felt, quite frankly. They really got rid of all the Jewish businesses. So the people who come to Stamford today see all these big buildings, and they don't know whether there was a different town. Of course, it was a factory town then. Most of our customers were, we had a very diverse group of customers, and most of them were ethnic. They worked at Yale in town, or they worked at Pitney Bowes or Stanford Rolling Mills or Norma Hoffman. And what's interesting to me that we've been out of business 30 years, and people still talk about us. It's just amazing that until a few years ago, my wife is a nurse in the recovery room at Stanford Hospital, and people would see the name and say, oh, we bought our furniture there, we know Alan. I never realized myself, because I was, sort of trying to run the thing. And of course, your father had a store down the street from us, Max Trell, right?
My father-in-law.
Your father-in-law. And of course, the deli was next to us. And Mr. Gottfried was always giving me a hard time that something was falling off our roof onto his building. There are just so many things that are different today. Of course, we remember, having been a member of the temple, of course, both my brother and I were bar mitzvahed at Temple Bethel on Prospect Street.
Your brother's name?
James. Jim lived, unfortunately, he became a patent attorney. He was quite successful. He died suddenly at the age of 52. He had a heart attack up at Stowe, Vermont. I'm sorry. I was thinking about my father and hunting. Each year they would bring back a deer, and we'd all run out. In those days there were fenders on cars. And I understand that they used to have a venison dinner for all the businessmen in town, somewhere up on Long Ridge Road. And I think my father and these gentlemen went until World War II started. I'd like to talk a little bit about my grandfather. My maternal grandfather, Philip Krumholz, came to this country, and I have his passport I'll show it to you later, from 1892. And his name he came from Galicia, a little town called Krashenko, which we visited about 20 years ago. And that was his name in Europe. Whereas Silberman, we don't know what the name is. We have no idea. But Krumholz, of course, it's German. It means bent wood. Galicia was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And of course, the passport's in German. And my grandfather, I believe, with the Wilkes, started the Hudson Paper Company, which used to be in Stamford, in downtown Stamford, and then urban renewal. Then they went to Hamilton Avenue. Then they moved up to Stratford. And I don't know if they exist anymore.
They may.
They may. But I don't think any Wilkes live in Stamford anymore. And they were sort of relatives, as I understand it. And because I used to see Seymour Wilk at the post office for years, all the time. And I know he passed away, and I think his his wife did. One of them did, anyway. And he worked for, he was supposed to be the money man, and then I think my grandfather, I'm told by my mother, his house still exists. He built a house at 48 Hillcrest Avenue. House is still there. And I'm told he lost most of his money in the Great Depression. And for most of his life, he worked as a salesman for Hudson Paper. And he was the one who was one of the founders of the temple. And he could walk from Hillcrest Avenue to the temple. And in those days, our temple was more reformed than it is now.
Temple Bethel.
Yeah, Bethel. And he, you know, he was religious, but he didn't wear a yarmulke on the street or anything. But in his heart he was, and he'd go every Friday night. And I know they kept a kosher home. My mother and grandmother would always fight that my mother wanted to give us milk. That was it. Grandpa Silberman was a pretty smart guy. After he moved to Norwich, he then spent the last 25 years of his life going to Florida every winter, which of course I think the kids probably paid for. Now that's pretty good for an immigrant. I don't do that. And I didn't know him as well because he lived up in Norwich. And my grandmother, Silberman, Fanny Silberman, died in the flu epidemic in World War I. And all the Silbermans are buried up on that cemetery off of, what's the one up there in Springdale? Independent Lodge. If you go there, there's a whole bunch of names. In fact, my great-grandmother is buried there. So she was born in the 1840s.
Her name?
Her name was her name Fanny? I'm not sure. Yehuda or something like that, I think.
Okay.
In fact, I visited there because I'm the only one left. There's nobody left at all. I visited there just a few weeks ago. I drive by and there's just so many Silbermans there. My grandfather, my uncle. In fact, one of my uncles, Samuel Silberman, whose name was Sil, was the leading commercial real estate broker in Stamford. In the 1940s and 50s, every building had Samuel H. Silberman on it. He really was the dominant force until he really got old. And then, of course, it became... But he was even more, better well known. And he died, I think he lived to be 90 years old. And he's buried up there in the Independent Lodge Cemetery, along with his second wife, and he lost a daughter who died at the age of 20 from not the best circumstances.
Right.
The other thing, of course, that you think of is that, for instance, you'd walk home. In those days, you'd walk down Pacific Street. When it was Pacific Street, there was no problem. You'd walk home. I remember when I got home from the Army, I was in basic training, and you do a lot of walking in the infantry. So it was easier to walk than take a bus. Stanford High School then, interesting enough, there were no black people. And in fact, there was one person in our class by the name of Roosevelt Richardson, and he may have been the only black person in Stanford High School at that time. This was 1943. It's hard to remember that. What else I remember is that I don't know if anyone remembers Berkey's Farm, but on Sundays we would drive out on Long Ridge Road, and there was a Mr. Berkey, and I remember him because he always had a leather strap on his hand, and we'd buy buttermilk. His house is still there. It's on the corner of, is it Sawmill on Long Ridge? That white house on the northwest corner, that was his house, and it was all farm. It was a dairy farm. And there was nothing up here at all. The only houses up here, essentially, were built by wealthy New York Jews who could not buy in Greenwich. The Sulzbergers, the Colemans over here on, the red house, okay. The Solomons, who else? Helena Rubinstein, I think, had a house here. and of course the Altschults, who were part of the Lehman family. So they were built. Those houses were built in the probably what 20s and 30s, and but there were none of the development houses at all up here. And in those days, you know, I remember when Barnum and Bailey came to Stamford. They came by train, so they came into the train station, and all the animals would walk up, and where Ridgeway is, that was a big field, and that's where the circus would be. I mean, happened every year. It was kind of exciting. Another interesting thing is that there used to be a restaurant called Park Row. Park Row restaurant. It was owned by the Coakless family. And every noon, all the Jewish businessmen and lawyers would have lunch there at a very large table in front of the restaurant. And I remember one of the biggest thrills I got was when my father would take me. You know, I can just visualize walking down Main Street, and Park Row to the restaurant. Park Row now is really where the sort of the mall is. You know, it's the square was there, and the Park Row was there, and Wallman's was around the corner, and I remember that was, I always got a kick out of that, and probably I would be in my 10 or 12 or maybe up until I was 15 or 16 or so. And then the Coaklesses closed it after the war and bought Halfway House out in Darien. The other thoughts I have, of course, is that I used to go to the Jewish Center, and they had a bowling alley there. And Queskin used to... Pete Queskin was the head guy, okay? He ran it for years and years, and his son, Bobby, was a great athlete, was a Marine in World War II. I think he served on Iwo Jima. And in later years, after he retired as a Greenwich policeman, he used to drive us to the airport. And he was a terrific guy. You know, I remember one year, the year we went to Poland, the kids were going to Florida, it was vacation. He went and picked them up at school, took them to the airport, and they were little. So I remember those things. Other things, of course, that there used to be a beach club in Japan near Ocean Drive East. I can't remember the name of it.
Clearview?
No, this is long before Clearview. Okay. Clearview was the old Bazagi estate. When I was a boy, we used to sleigh ride down there. As a matter of fact, Clearview was at the end of what was Fairview Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And when my parents moved to Japan, there was no beach there, it was all rocks. And the neighbors hired a team of horses and cleared all those rocks. The neighbors wanted to do what they did at Landmark Road, where the beach is now owned by association. The neighbors wanted to do that, but we didn't have the political pull in those days, because everybody on the board said, "Oh, the rich people live in Japan. We're not going to do that for them." So it was never done. It was always left as a public beach, but it was only like 50 feet wide. But those beaches right there, between there and what's now Woodway, is the best beach in Stamford, because it doesn't have a channel, and at low tide it used to have a beautiful sandbar. It was nice to spend all our summers on that beach. And then years later, I can't remember the name. I remember the father, the man who bought that property and built Clearview Beach Club. Sweisberg. Yeah. The father was always, I remember the father used to yell at us all the time, because we used to go over there. We used to sleigh ride on that land, and we used to sleigh ride on Hobson Street. And of course, in those days, you remember in the 30s and 40s, they didn't put salt on the roads, so there was still snow all the time, and we used to sleigh ride there. And the steepest hill in Japan was Sagamore Hill. That was the steepest, and we went down there. Talking about Stamford and going back, and this is a little bit about weather. You know, there were no organized sports in those days. You went out in the field and you made up a game. And we used to, where Stamford Yacht Club is, right next to it used to be sort of a semi-swamp. You probably couldn't build on something like that today because it had weeds. And we'd dam it up and play hockey there. And one year it was cold enough so that we actually played hockey on the Sound, where the Rusty Scupper used to be, okay? That really used to be called Palmer's Island. There was a family that lived there in the construction business, but now, of course, it's all filled in. And that's sort of like an inlet. And that froze over one year, and we played hockey on it. This had to be 39, 42, up until then, because I went away to school after that. And, you know, the kids don't do that now. They all go to an ice rink. My son went to an ice rink. I guess about myself, I married late in life. I was 45 years old, and I have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. They grew up in Stamford, of course. Both of them went away to boarding school, followed their father to Hotchkiss. Lauren graduated from Barnard and is a photographer. And Allison graduated also from Colby, my alma mater, as did Bobby, our son. And she got her master's degree from Columbia and works as a urban planning in the office of the mayor of New York now. They're both still single. And of course I had a son who was a hockey player, amongst other things. Senior year he played hockey at Stanford High School and then went to Colby also and graduated there and died from cancer 3 years ago. But he left many friends as well as Molly. What else can I tell you? It's just so different. I mean, everybody had one car. Nobody had 3 cars or 4 cars or whatever people have now. And everybody knew you.
I have a question about going back to the business of
Okay.
Stanford,
All right.
and did you experience any anti-Semitism?
No, not at all. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting question because I was very conscious of it. When I went to boarding school, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism. And most Jewish boys who went to these boarding schools came from the old banking families of New York. And how I got in there, I'm not sure. And as a matter of fact, interesting enough, we're having a guest tomorrow. His name is Stephen Birmingham, who's a classmate of mine. Stephen's the one that wrote Our Crowd and those books, and he's a good friend of mine, and he's coming up with his tomorrow afternoon. I always thought about that. And interesting enough, if I went to an organization, whether Italian or Polish or Irish, and I looked at the list of names, almost every one of them was our customer. The only people who weren't our customers were Jewish people. It was very interesting. It was, and it was always a little bit of and we, you know, I didn't realize what kind of reputation we had until, as I said before, until I got out of the business. Until people, you know, I had an experience and people would say to me, "Gee, you know, well, I was a customer of your store like, I mean, we've been going 30 years. Half of Stanford doesn't even know that it existed." The only time, remember, we did have one incident, I'll never forget. My brother must have just gotten out of law school, and he wrote to this man, and this man wrote this most apologetic letter. But the bulk of our customers, in fact, we had a good percentage of customers from Darien because of where we were located downtown Stanford. But it was and people, it was just a different world. And I'll tell you how Stanford was different then. In those days, we were open Thursday nights. This is before Martin Luther King was killed. And Thursday night, you'd sit there to 8:30, not a soul would come in. All of a sudden, you'd be mobbed with people. You'd lock the doors at 9 o'clock, and people would stay and buy till 10 o'clock. Well, then when the Martin Luther King was killed and the riots came, that killed the night business entirely. It was just different. But in those days, people came out, and downtown Stanford was filled with people, and you know, going to all the local stores. No,
So
there
I
was
have
never any.
I have a question. If you say the Jews did not shop
Yeah.
for furniture in your store,
Yeah.
where were they shopping?
Well, you see, I said that this was the ghetto mentality. This is what I thought. We were a one-price store, okay? And it worked in those days.
Meaning what?
That whatever the price was on it, that's what you sold it for, period. There was no handling. And I brought that with me, and it worked. But also, we were better buyers than other stores, frankly. And when we'd go out, and in those days it wasn't like today where you have a Drexel store or a Thomasville store. Every one of these companies were individually owned by families. So if you decided you needed a French provincial dining room in a certain price range, you went around to different places and you'd buy the best value. It had the best finish, maybe it was less money, you know. And so you pre-shop for the customer. Today, and this is why these stores have this, like Ethan Allen, it was the first one that wanted their own store. So they don't compete with anybody. And they cover the furniture with a lot of tchotchkes so you can't really see it. And they were the first ones that did this, and they were very successful at it. If you took an Ethan Allen dresser and you put it next to a Jamestown Sterling, which was a company up in Jamestown, and you looked at the two, there was no comparison. Jamestown Sterling was bigger, it had better detail, it had better finish, and it was probably less money. So in those days you could buy the best at the market. And so that gave you, if you were good enough and you had a competitive advantage. My feeling was about the Jewish people, we absolutely, you couldn't exist that way today, because when we had a sale in February and August, those were the two furniture sale months, we'd give 10% off. Now, can you imagine anybody giving 10% off? They'd laugh at you. What are you kidding? It's got to be 40% off. Of course, it really isn't. What they've done is they've taken the markup and added on 40%. The manufacturer suggested, you know, and then they give you 40% off. In fact, I always felt that the stores that handled, like Sabini's, got a better markup than we did, because instead of buying what you liked, you bought discount thing. And I remember one day we had a guy, and I specifically remember it. He was an Italian man, and we had the bulk of our customers were really Italian, because Stamford was really an Italian town. My father used to say he almost had to speak Italian, and he wanted a better price, and I wouldn't. And I'll tell you why I wouldn't budge. Not only for this customer, but for our salesman, because once you let someone do that, the weaker salesperson would come back to you every time, and pretty soon you would be a different. You couldn't do that today. You got to give 50% off. Or, in fact, when we were first married, and of course I, coming from a department store, and Mary C went out and she came back and she said, "Look at this, it was regularly 150 and I bought it for 70. And I said, that regular was the never was price. Never was, and of course we see it at Lord & Taylor today. Who would ever buy something without a coupon? So I mean, you'd think you were stupid. And that's, so the whole, and of course that's the change of our society, that everything is not quite as genuine. I can tell another story. I always like this story. A few years ago they were doing a reevaluation, and I went down. I don't know, is this relevant to?
Or not.
Okay.
It's part of.
I went down that night to the Zoning Board of Appeals. And I was the last one, and I got the head of the Zoning Board of Appeals, who was an old Irishman who had been head of the board for many years. And he was probably in his 80s, and he subsequently died a few months later. And we came in and we started talking, and he knew Silberman's furniture, and he talked about us. And I can't remember his name, but when our interview ended, he said, "Gee, Alan, I'm glad you were my last interview. I really enjoyed talking to you." And I figured, wow, I'm gonna get a reduction, but they threw the whole thing out, so it never came. But just the attitude, we talked about the store and how people felt about individual stores. because they were all individual stores. You dealt with the owners, or
No chains.
no chains. And I was one of the people that when Bloomingdales first came to Stamford, there was a hearing at Burdick School. And I went and I explained to them how this would hurt Stamford business, because in each store, each person owned a home in Stamford. He owned a car, he bought here, and in a big store like Bloomingdale's, what, the manager of the department don't make anything, you know, it was not, it would change the nature of the town. Of course, eventually it did. Now you have all kinds of things that are different. But probably young people don't know what Macwick Labs was. That was a very successful. It was bought by Raytheon, and I don't think they exist anymore. And of course, Pitney Bowes had a great reputation. I remember Walter Wheeler was a customer of ours. It was just so different. And of course, what people don't realize is that Canal Street was really a canal, and it went up to the. My father talks about that. In fact, my father says he remembers when the first town hall burnt down. And when we used to get a high tide at the equinox, all of Canal Street and Lower Pacific Street, the water would come up until urban renewal, and they cut that off. The death of the downtown was urban renewal, and the people who weren't affected, like the people on Bedford Street, kind of turned their back on us. And eventually, of course, it affected them, because that used to be the best shopping street in southern Connecticut, long before Greenwich Avenue. And of course, it's not much anything anymore. And
Can you remember some of the stores on Bedford Street?
matter of fact, just interesting, funny. Yesterday, I was sitting next to a man at the table. I don't even remember his name. Part of this good old boys who lives at Edge Hill, and he said to me, "Do you remember Ethel Netburn?" And I said, "Of course." As a matter of fact, she lived around the corner from me on my first house on Vineyard Lane. And Ethel Allen, and of course the French shop had a reputation that they were very snooty, and that, you know, but and Bob Sports. As a matter of fact, as a thing of interest, my brother was a skier, and he was a patent attorney, so he had graduated from engineering school, and he had an Alfa Romeo. And in those days, the only ski rack they made for a convertible went on the side door, so the passenger couldn't get out. So he invented this ski rack that went on the trunk, and he called it the ski port. And he used to ski up at Stowe. And people said, "Where do you get one of these?" And he said, "Well, you don't, I made it." So he went into business. And we assembled them. In fact, we assembled them in the cellar of our house. We showed them at the ski market in those days was at the Hotel McAlpin in New York. We sold them all over the United States. I mean, we sold them to people like Hudson's, which was a big department store, C. Buckmeyer, which doesn't exist anywhere near. And as a matter of fact, one of the people who assembled it, when Petey Plotnick was between something, I think he had gotten out of law school, he hadn't gone to law school, he worked and assembled them in the cellar. We sold them all over. And Jimmy wasn't a patent attorney yet. And I guess he hadn't gone to law school, he was still in there. And he went to a patent attorney and said, "You can't patent it," because someone in Europe had patented this idea. When he became a patent attorney, he realized he could have, and an outfit by the name of Barracrafters copied it. And so it was fun. We ran that for 3, 4, 5 years, and it was interesting. He was very clever.
Right.
He was a real engineer.
Well, you mentioned sports, and you wrote about how
well,
active you still are.
Yeah.
Tell some of the things that you've done.
Well, what I used to do is, when our season ended in February, I would go to Europe skiing, mostly to Austria. I'd ski for 3 weeks. I skied in St. Anton and Bad Gastein. In fact, one year I bought a Volkswagen over there, picked it up in Munich, drove over the mountains to, that year I skied in Bad Gastein, which used to be a very great summer resort in the days of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, with huge hotels. I skied at St. Anton and Zures, and I used to spend 3 weeks there, and it was, I enjoyed it. And then I had a couple of funny things. One day I was on a ski lift with a very nice man. Maybe I was 30-ish, and he was in his 50s. He came from Bloomingdales, which is a town where I used to ski was called the Vorarlberg, and came from Bloomingdales, and he told me he learned his English in a British prisoner of war camp, and I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. I turned to him and I said, "You know something, I bet you thought in 1940 you were on the winning side." He never said another word to me, which you're damn right he did. Well, I went to there 4 or 5 years, and one day I just thought to myself, maybe it could became I'm more conscious of this, that maybe what was that guy across the counter doing 15 years ago? And I never went back, never went to Austria. Subsequently, I went on another trip one year to Stade, Switzerland, and that's where I met my wife.
Oh, I was
She was
going
on
to get
vacation there. And we've been back several times. Colby had some trips. We went to Zell one year, and we went to Kitzbühel. And a few years ago, we went to Cortina, and she did a job on her leg on the second day. The skiing in Austria it's not as good as out west because it's lower, but the life is different. They really, it's really an interesting.
Your other hobby was hiking?
Oh yeah, I've climbed, actually with a Hotchkiss friend of mine who will also be here Sunday. We climbed the highest mountain in every state in New England. We even tried to do it in Rhode Island. We went up there to Newport. We said, we got to do this. We got to find the highest mountain. So we pull up on where the map is in somebody's backyard. So we never got that. But what we really wanted to do was climb Mount Mitchell, which was the highest mountain east of the Mississippi. It's in North Carolina. And that year, after all the years of planning, we made our reservations to go to Asheville, North Carolina. And that September, there were these hurricanes. We had 3 hurricanes. In fact, the day we arrived was a hurricane. So the next morning we got up and we had to go on the Blue Ridge Parkway, and it was blocked. So we never got there. We never got there. And I thought I turned this off. Excuse me. I served as the men's club board, and I was president for 1 year. And in those years, the men's club still operated. And I remember we used to have weekends at the Camcorder. It was fun, and we had ball games and things. Subsequently, it doesn't really exist anymore. The reason being that originally the people who were members were local people who had businesses here. It was not only, it was also a social thing. But now most of the guys either commute to New York, they get home too late, or they commute all over the world or the United States. So that doesn't exist. And I joined Kiwanis about 26 years ago. I served as president of the club, and then I served as lieutenant governor of the district. And I enjoyed that. We traveled, 1 year we had the international convention was in Orlando, and the kids were little, so of course we took them. And 1 year it was in Taipei, and Mary C. and I did that. We went to Hong Kong and Tokyo. I didn't care much for Taipei, but so it's provided some fun, and I've enjoyed it for many years. And we do lots of good things. One of the things, we have a golf tournament. Once a year I play golf. That's the only day I play golf. And we raise money for the community. And we have a fruit sale in December, which they run out of my warehouse, which is, you know, it's a fundraiser. So I've enjoyed that over the years. I do still, I interview for Colby, and I've gotten some kids in. It's hard today to get kids in. One time, several years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I was able, it was easier to get in. Now it's almost impossible. I mean, the kid has to get in himself, you know. I still go up to what's here, Mianus River Glen, and I hike around there. My knees aren't very good anymore, but that's it. And I still ski. I really enjoyed that. I used to ski 30 days a year, and I play tennis, and I ride my bike. As a matter of fact, last year I took an interesting trip. Mary C. took Allison to last year, yeah. Last year, I took a trip to with VBT, and we went from Charleston to Savannah. Well, we didn't ride from the town, but we rode all the outer islands. It was very interesting, and when I was in Savannah, which is a great city, there's an old synagogue there. And this synagogue, or this congregation, is the second oldest congregation of any type in Savannah. There's only one congregation or Presbyterian congregation that's older. And interesting enough, we lost our son on the 26th. So we say Kaddish for him on the 26th of every month, no matter where we are. Last month we were in Newport, and we went to the synagogue there, which is the oldest synagogue in the United States. Absolutely beautiful place. It was filled with Hasidim, and I couldn't follow that service. I mean, it was like in another world. And Mary C. was in Crete one year, and she found the synagogue there. But wherever we go on the 26th, we find a place. Other than that,
Have you been to Israel?
well, matter of fact, yes, I have. We're going to Israel the 10th of September. A number of years ago, we were members of Hall, and we had a disabled Israeli veteran who we stayed in contact with. He got blown off a tank and he had trouble walking, and the Israeli government sends him to New York every few years to get a nerve block, and he comes and stays with us, and he calls us. Well, last March, his youngest daughter was in the United States. She's a ballerina or something. She traveled around the United States. We went in and took her to dinner. Her boyfriend flew over and proposed to her, so she's getting married September 14th. So after promising him that we'd come back, we're going with the two girls on the 10th of September, and we're going to be there till the 25th. And we're going to her wedding on the 14th. And we planned a whole trip. We're going to drive to a lot, and we're going to go to, what's the place in Jordan?
Petra.
Yeah, Petra, yeah. The biggest problem with the trip is that they planned the wedding between the two holidays. So by Yom Kippur, we're really restricted to what we can do. But we went, the temple had a trip the year Lauren was bar mitzvah, which was 20 years ago. And we went, the whole family went there, and that was, yeah, it was fun. But this we're really looking forward to.
Okay.
And I don't know what else to tell you.
I have all the notes, and I think you've covered wonderfully everything in your life, and didn't know if there was just anything else you would like to say.
Well, first of all, I appreciate that you're doing this. I think it's terrific giving your time, because people will just never know. When I think of my father, sometimes, I walk through the cemetery and I see names there that don't exist anymore. That my father used to talk about, like Mall there are no malls left anymore. And of course I knew Fred Robbins, the JWB. He was an uncle of Dick Martin, Fred was, and he was very active in and of course I do have a membership in the Jewish War Veterans, but I don't attend any meetings, but I attended one meeting and I saw they really didn't know how to run one. One of the things about a meeting is that you start it and you end it at a certain time, and I think that's very important. And they started it okay, but it went on, and I don't have the patience for that. Other than that, I guess I've had a pretty good life. Disappointments, of course. My parents lived, my father lived a full life. My mother lived 5 years too long. She was 91. Sometimes when the mind starts to go, you do a lot of dumb things. My family, the Silbermans all lived to be 90. And I guess if I had disappointments, I always wanted that, there are very few furniture businesses, or any businesses, that have the name of the person who runs it has the same name as on the front. And all of my friends who ran fine stores in Connecticut, they're all gone now. Their names were not on the front. I always wanted that to go on, but it wasn't in the books too. And outside of, and of course the loss of my son was the biggest disappointment.
So this interview will be kept for you to have a DVD for your family to share,
Thank you.
and there may be some something on the video, the DVD that they didn't know about, and there'll be news for them, but it'll be there for posterity. And we have one that will stay with the Jewish Historical Society in our archives,
Right.
and we invite you to come to the archives because you would be amazed at what we have collected. And but we thank you so much
Well, thank you for
for
doing it.
having
I think
us.
that's terrific. Yeah.